ESG is not an esoteric concept, it's about survival. Our panel today are going to summarize the business impact of ESG in terms of our planet, people and profit. And specifically, of course, given this audience today, we're going to be covering what ESG means for marketing leaders and what we could be doing and should be doing about it. As I look around that sea of familiar faces and names, we've got some extraordinary representation in our audience today, from Virgin to Lego to RBS to Starbucks to Beam Suntory, EE, many more. So thank you for joining us. So let me introduce today's panel, and I'll also run through our running order for this morning. So firstly, hello, I'm Kate Harrison. I'll chair our session this morning. I am a partner with an executive search and advisory company called Savannah Group. So I'm a marketing headhunter, and I help companies across all industry sectors and all sizes of companies, from major multinational corporation to earlier stage. I help them identify and acquire leaders in marketing, in customer, commercial, communications, and creative. I'm going to introduce you to Matt Peacock. Matt is a partner with strategic and creative advisory firm Blurred, and he specializes in ESG and purpose. From the most technical aspects of ESG through to the most creative expressions of purpose, Blurred helps businesses be better businesses. And they ensure everybody knows about it, from consumers to employees to policymakers and beyond. Matt also lectures on ESG at international business schools, and he joined Blurred after a 20-year career in major international corporations, including Vodafone, where he led the global ESG effort and strategy and communications programs. He's also a former communications regulator and was part of the leadership team that established Ofcom. He's also ex-oil and gas industry experience. We're going to hear firstly from Matt for about 20 minutes, perhaps with a pause for Q&A on Matt's sessions, if that we're running on time. Before then, we hand over to Leo Raymond and Fern Miller. And Leo and Fern are global partners at Gray Consulting. And Gray Consulting is present in the UK, in the US, and in China, and is a growth and transformation company, part of WPP's newly merged AKQA group. Gray Consulting specializes in designing future-facing propositions and business models, as well as developing the internal capabilities for their clients required to deliver them. They've worked on ESG projects for clients including GSK, Kellogg's, Nestle, and have a really exciting partnership with a sustainability incubator called Green Lab. Most of you may know that previously Leo was the chief executive of Gray London before founding Gray Consulting to bring the very best of creativity and management consultancy together. Fern was previously global chief strategy officer at Digital LBI, and she recently ran a research project for the Green Party to define their Green New Deal. After Leo and Fern, we'll hear from Sam Grant for about 20 minutes. And Sam indeed will summarize the key actions and takeouts from all of our 3 sessions this morning, followed by an overall Q&A that I can oversee, running to our close at 10:30 this morning, should we need it. As I've said, this session is being recorded, so we can provide the follow-up contact, and please feel free to post your questions in the chat that I can then bring up after the 3 expert panel speakers have delivered their sessions. So Sam, to introduce Sam Grant, he is a marketing leader. He was most recently the Chief Marketing Officer for Samsung, UK and Ireland, and he has also been at Coca-Cola, at Mars, and at Unilever. He has dedicated the last year to fighting climate change through various ventures and is convinced that we can save our future generations and make great businesses grow. So, audience, steel yourselves. We're going to learn some borderline terrifying and sometimes apocalyptic facts and predictions today. If business, if marketing doesn't act, our futures will suffer in the most profound way. But we're also going to learn or remember that as marketing leaders, we're very best placed to steer positive change. And our expert panel today have got some bulletproof insights and ideas to help us all make a start or indeed continue the momentum that we've begun to build. I'm looking forward to this morning. And Matt, over to you to start, please.
Great, thank you. Right, let's hope the Zoom gods are smiling and I will share my screen so I can take you through some slides. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. ESG is a fairly new acronym in the business world, and there are still a lot of people running businesses, including at the C-suite level, by the way, who've not heard of the term before. So if you're not familiar with the term, don't feel ashamed, you are not alone. To begin at the beginning, ESG is environmental, social governance, and the full stops after each word are there for a reason, because the first thing to understand about ESG is it's an amalgam of three separate categories of risk: environmental risk, societal risk, and governance risk. And each of those three categories breaks down into two subcategories. So the second point here to understand is that ESG has 6 components in total, 2 under each of the E and the S and the G. The E splits into climate change and linked to that energy strategy. And the second subcategory under the E is the protection of natural resources and the mitigation of negative impacts on ecological systems. The S in the middle splits into a company's internal stakeholders, so its workforce and how it manages its workplace, challenges like diversity and inclusion, for example, or safety management. And the second subcategory under the S relates to the company's external stakeholders, its customers, the communities around its operations, and its broader impact on civil society. In effect, its human rights impact, which, by the way, is very often the single most challenging aspect of ESG for many companies. And the G splits down into shareholder rights, essentially traditional public company corporate governance, so questions focused on board independence and the equitable treatment of shareholders, for example. And the second subcategory relates to corporate culture, business integrity matters, so challenges like bribery and corruption. Now, these are six very different categories of risk. So ensuring corporate governance code compliance requires totally different expertise to mitigating the risk of child slavery in the supply chain, for example. So why are these 6 subcategories bolted together under the one acronym of ESG? Well, the reason why is because what's common to these 6 subcategories of risk is that they all force the company to look at risk in a completely different way. I've written many public company annual reports over the years, and the traditional approach to a company's statement of principal risks and uncertainties, which I'm sure many of you know from annual reports, is to consider the range of negative impacts that could impair the company's ability to deliver its short-term guidance and its long-range plans, typically over a 1 to 3 year timeframe. The perspective is, in essence, what are the bad things that could happen to the enterprise in the near term? ESG flips that thinking around. It's all about identifying the negative impacts caused by the company to the people and the planet around it, and over a much longer time frame, up to 10 years typically. So ESG basically forces companies to rewire their risk management systems, to think holistically looking outwards, not narrowly looking inwards. And the consequence of that inversion in thinking, looking outwards, not inwards, and thinking long-term, not short-term, is that companies that are serious about addressing their ESG risks tend to become much more resilient over time than those that are not as focused on ESG. So those are the kind of basic concepts. And I'm now just going to give you a very, very quick tour of the most important factors underpinning ESG, beginning with the E, environmental, and most importantly, what's happening to the climate. So as I'm sure you all know, 5 years ago at a summit in Paris, world leaders committed to the 2 goals on the slide here. One is difficult, the so-called 2-degree scenario. And the other, which is an aspiration really, is even harder, the so-called 1.5-degree scenario. So that was the plan 5 years ago. And this is the reality. It's all going in the wrong direction. The bottom two lines are what needs to happen, and the top line is what humanity is actually on course to do under current plans. Now, all of this sounds theoretical, I know, and a couple of degrees Celsius doesn't sound like much, but that's not how atmospheric science works. Small movements have massive implications. So for context, to show you what those implications look like, this map shows water stress by region by 2040 on current projections. Rising temperatures mean that the countries in red will be drawing down more water than the planet can supply 20 years from now. On a daily basis, the people in these countries in red will not have enough water to grow food or meet their basic needs. This is pretty catastrophic data. And here's another, frankly, even more frightening projection, this time 50 years out to 2070. And this map looks at what's known as the wet bulb effect, rather strange title, but that's what it's called. And that's when very high temperatures, so extreme summer heat, happen in places that also have very high humidity. In the countries in dark orange on this map, during the hottest months of the year, it would not be possible for human beings to survive outdoors for much more than a few minutes. Core body functions cannot operate under these conditions. And for many people, particularly the poor, without air conditioning, living on subsistence farms on the land or in slums in crowded cities, human life will simply not be viable in these orange zones in the summertime. Survival would mean migrating north into the green and in massive numbers, potentially 3 to 5 billion people by 2070. It's pretty terrifying stuff. Now the S, which in ESG really means societal risk, though it's called social, it means societal. In other words, the risks that arise if a company causes harm to people and the risks that arise as a consequence of public concern about corporate activities. And the context here is significant public anger directed at large companies and multinational corporations in particular. And here's one factor behind that anger. So this is a pretty famous piece of econometric modeling called the elephant curve, and it's created by a World Bank economist called Branko Milanovic. And what Milanovic did is he mapped income growth of the global population segmented by income distribution over a 30-year period from 1988 to 2008. So the horizontal axis at the bottom of the chart has the bottom of 5% by income distribution on the far left and the globally wealthy in the top 5% on the far right. The vertical axis on the left of the chart shows income growth in real terms over that period. Yeah, so that's just to explain how the chart's laid out. At the extreme left of the chart are the global super poor, the bottom 5% who had virtually nothing in 1988 and still had virtually nothing 30 years later. On the extreme right of the chart are the top 1 or 2% of the globally wealthy whose incomes increased by up to 60%. The story of this chart, and the reason why this is such a powerful piece of modeling and cited right the way across the ESG world, is in the contrast between the bulge on the left in the middle of the chart, the back of the elephant, as it were, and the dramatic plunge down to the beginning of the elephant's trunk on the right of the chart. The elephant's back on the left are the emerging middle classes of developing nations, China in particular. And the plunge on the right down into negative income growth are the very large majority of the populations of the developed world, the US and Europe in particular. The people at the bottom of the elephant's trunk down in the negative territory are those who've lost out from globalization. And this data, by the way, it's relatively old, but it's a powerful story, so it's still very useful. It stops in 2008. So it doesn't even take account of the global financial crisis, let alone obviously the COVID pandemic. So on the left of the chart, on the elephant's back, there's the incredible dynamism of China and the potential of India, transformation, optimism, growth. And on the right of the chart, where the elephant's trunk dips down into negative territory, there's stagnation, Brexit, Trump, the Rust Belt, resentment, all of that. The large majority of the world's largest companies, many of the companies that we all work for or have worked for, are domiciled in and generate most of their revenue from countries whose populations sit in the right-hand third of this chart. And these are the left behind people, and they are furious that the people on the tip of the trunk on the far right have essentially enriched themselves by transferring growth and opportunity to the people over on the left on the back of the elephant. This is really, really dangerous territory. Each and every leader of a large company sits up at the tip of the elephant's trunk, together with everyone else in a middle or senior management role in corporate life. One other macroeconomic slide to illustrate the point, and this zooms in on the contrast between the bottom of the elephant's trunk and the tip of the elephant's trunk. So this chart shows US census data from the late 1940s up to 2018, and it maps real-term income growth across socioeconomic groups, rather like the previous chart. What's striking here is that from the late 1940s through to the mid-1970s, the people in the bottom 80% of earners in the US, the gray bars on the chart, experienced consistent real-term increases in average incomes that were well ahead of the top 20%, and within that 20%, the wealthiest 5%, who are represented by the dark pink bars on this chart. And then in the mid-1970s, the economist Milton Friedman, who has a great deal to answer for, to put it mildly, came up with the notion of shareholder primacy. And what he essentially said was that the only role of a business was to generate profits for its shareholders, with no requirement to consider its social responsibilities. That's what he said in an essay he wrote in the early to mid-70s. And Friedman-inspired economics swept through the political, corporate, and investment landscape, and it's like someone flipped a switch, because suddenly, from the mid-70s onwards, the wealthiest 5% are pulling away from the rest of US society in each successive US census, apart from the final period, which is affected by the global financial crisis. This is where Make America Great Again really comes from. It's a desire to go back to those pre-globalized years on the left of this chart, when lower socioeconomic groups saw consistent increases in their earnings. And you can see data similar to this in all other major economies, including in the UK, with similar patterns of rising inequality over the last 3 generations. And that's where the 99% come from. These are the people left behind by globalization, and also unequal beneficiaries under Friedman economics. Now, if you think I'm kind of overstating these trends, there's some really interesting opinion research, again from the US, that's worth looking at. So after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia descended into chaos, there was a joke that Karl Marx was wrong about everything except capitalism. And 31 years later, for a new generation of Americans, that old joke has new meaning. I mean, look at the numbers on this chart, and these are from 2 very large sample US opinion polls. A significant number of millennials in the US are losing faith in the current model of capitalism. And that's a theme that obviously we've seen play out within the Democratic Party in the lead up to the US election. And these numbers, again, predate the COVID pandemic. They also predate this. From an ESG perspective, the Black Lives Matter movement isn't just about policing and racist politics. The movement also reflects material multi-generational disadvantage purely as a consequence of ethnicity. And again, this is data from the US, but you can find similar charts in other countries, including here in the UK. This imbalance is reshaping politics, and the US election, again, being another example of that. And it's also reshaping public expectations of business. So what do investors think about all of this? The people that own the companies that we all work for? Well, first and foremost, the climate crisis is now seen as a critical threat to value. So this map of the US is produced by the capital markets research group MSCI. And what it shows is the projected increase in probability and severity of climate-related physical events, so wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, and so on, over the next 20 years, mapped at county level across the US. There are trillions of dollars of value at risk on this map, from real estate to agriculture, food production, manufacturing. In fact, actually, if you think about it, pretty much every sector there is. If the worst case scenario plays out, This map represents the greatest act of value destruction in history, quite apart from the human consequences. So investors are hugely focused on the link between climate change and asset value. And they now expect companies to disclose how they are mitigating the impact of climate-related risks to the P&L, particularly under this initiative, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD for short. ESG, I'm afraid, is more awash with acronyms than any other industry or any other line of thinking I've ever come across. And this is one of the most famous and one of the more complicated ones. So TCFD basically amounts to new rules under which all companies will report on the impact of climate-related risks on their balance sheet. And that's everything from the impact on revenue and the impact on liabilities to capital allocation and book value. So all of the core financial reporting metrics. If climate risk means your numbers could move over time, then you'll need to tell your investors about that risk as you would any other material risk. So TCFD basically puts the planet alongside profit as a core financial reporting obligation. It's a really, really important change. And I can tell you from our own work at Blurred, dealing with clients on all of these issues, that TCFD can raise some really, really difficult questions. So to give you a hypothetical example, which I promise you is not linked to any of our actual clients, because that would be improper of me to do that. If your business is in food and drink production, you rely on water as a raw material, and your largest plant, the major source of your production, is next to a river that will have dried up completely within the next 10 years. What is your plan to protect the enterprise from a material reduction in book value as the world gets hotter? And what do you say about that plan today to your investors? These are really, really hard questions to address. Meanwhile, 2020 has, of course, been an inflection point in terms of the S of ESG. Whilst the consequences of climate risk are now widely understood and increasingly, certainly in our experience, acted on from an investor perspective, what COVID has revealed is that the consequences of human risk, social instability, the fragility of the workforce, the fragility of long and complex global supply chains have all been woefully underestimated. And there's also growing concern about the destabilizing effects of inequality, especially between majority and minority ethnic groups. To the point now, by the way, that some institutional investors that we know in our work are now talking informally almost about rebasing ESG as SEG, on the basis that societal weakness, economic instability, loss of trust in institutions, conflict arising from cultural and political polarization are as serious a threat to asset values as the climate crisis, and actually are even more acute in the shorter term. So this data really focused minds. This is public company reporting data from the first quarter of this year, which included the first full impact of the first few months of the COVID pandemic. And what's striking here in this data is that companies rated as AAA ESG performers, on average, outperform the market as a whole going to the downturn, in the sense that they lost less value than the market as a whole. Now, there are a number of factors behind this chart, to be clear, including the fact that most of the big technology firms are also ESG leaders, and clearly technology, the technology sector has been the big winner in the market since February. Also, there are no ESG leaders in the oil industry, so ESG leaders weren't exposed to the recent collapse in commodity prices. But there's a lot more to this particular chart than those two factors. And it comes back again to the point I made earlier about how ESG forces a rewiring of company risk management systems. To get to a AAA ESG rating, companies have to develop a comprehensive understanding of their supply chains. And they also need to focus on creating optimal conditions for the workforce, both of which attributes, it turns out, made a big difference when a pandemic like COVID began. Another point to bear in mind, by the way, is that an increasing number of people working on ESG within the investment community are millennials. There's a generational shift underway within finance, which is also an important factor. Final data point for me to reinforce this. This is more MSCI data, this time predating COVID and covering 4 years from 2015 to 2019. So what MSCI did is they looked at the average cost of debt and the average cost of capital for companies across the 3 major capital markets, comparing companies that have a AAA ESG rating with companies that have much worse or very poor ESG scores. And the differences between the leaders and the laggards in ESG terms are material. Almost 100 basis points in terms of cost of debt in the US, for example. Now, I don't know if any of you have worked on corporate debt or capital raising programs in the past, but 100 basis points is a lot. Reducing average annual interest costs by up to 1 percentage point per year is not a trivial number. Now, for multinational corporations in particular, that kind of movement really matters. To give you an illustrative example, my previous employer, Vodafone, currently has total net debt of around 60 billion euros, which at my last count actually exceeds its market capitalization, but there you go, and an annual operating profit of around 4 billion. So 100 basis points movement, theoretically, in terms of cost of debt for a company like Vodafone would equate to a theoretical movement in debt and capital costs of around 600 million euros a year. That's not a small number. It's worth doing the maths within your own companies. The numbers associated with raising your ESG rating in terms of the impact on your WACC, your weighted average cost of capital, and your cost of debt, could be pretty helpful in any conversations that you have about your own ESG business case within your own companies. So in essence, ESG is all about doing the right thing by the planet and the right thing by people, but it's not enough to do the right thing. You also need to be seen to do the right thing. There's an old axiom in the human rights world, which is my sort of heartland in ESG, know and show. You have to know what your risks are and know how to deal with them. And you also, equally importantly, need to show that you know what those risks are and that you know how to deal with them, which means your narrative is just as important as your policies and procedures. ESG ratings are based entirely on public domain information. What's on your website and in your sustainability report and your annual report, and also what NGOs, media, and regulators and other external stakeholders say about your company. And this is central to how we work at Blurred, because what we do is we combine a very deep ESG technical consultancy, and believe me, we get super geeky about this kind of stuff, with what I would say are world-class narrative and creative skills. Fixing and telling are 2 sides of the same coin. Both matter equally. And I think that's a really important point to finish on for everyone on this call, because all of us are ultimately in the business of storytelling and influencing consumer and stakeholder perception. Don't underestimate the significance of that aspect of your role when you consider your own company's ESG ambitions. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And fixing and telling combined will stay with me certainly for a long time. We've got a great question from Michael. Thank you, Michael. I'm also conscious of time though. So Michael, I'm going to capture that question and put it into the Q&A session at the end. Leo and Fern, may we move on to you guys, please?
Yep. So I'm just going to get the deck up. Hopefully you can all see that. Can everyone see that? So thank you, Matt and Kate. We thought we'd jump off the platform that Matt has so eloquently and clearly articulated and talk to you a little bit about what to do. Because our feeling is that, you know, you understand that ESG provides a significant source of risk. And a lot of the reason why we did the event today with the guys is to have a clear link between ESG and the role of the marketer, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we could tell you about the importance of ESG in affecting the value of your business. We could talk to you about, you know, climate change as the fundamental crisis that we're all facing, and questioning around capitalism. We could talk to you about the fact that sustainable companies, for example, are much more resilient and seem to grow faster, but you know all that already. So we're very keen not to do that, actually. What we thought we'd do instead is talk about how do you systematically and purposefully go about unpicking some of the barriers that are preventing, frankly, the marketing community from taking, I think, significant, really, really fundamental responsibility for shifting ESG scores for an organization. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start really by thinking about how do you get over the following? hopefully you can see that. There are two very dangerous words, we think, in this whole space for marketers, and that is yes, but. So, you know, it'd be very hard to find someone in your organization or in your marketing teams or beyond that would resist the idea that dealing with climate change might be a good thing and that there must be some corporate responsibility for it. But what we encounter significantly, and what we've had reported from you guys, frankly, is, yeah, but I've got other things I need to worry about, or I'm not sure how exactly to align what I want to do in kind of values sense with what will actually make a difference and keep me in my job and demonstrate success to my boss, frankly. And that's why I want to tackle that. So with Fern's assistance, we're going to go through and talk to you about some of those examples. And the first one, Fern, you want to take this up?
Yeah, so this picks up on what I think is a key constraint to the progress towards ESG measures, and one that we noticed in talking to a member of the corporate affairs team for a major company, where they reported that the marketing leader's response in their company quite fairly pointed out that they have short-term measures they need to hit. They need to hit their quarterly targets. That's where the revenue comes from on customer acquisition. And that currently the sustainable marketing proposition they had was not the most compelling. So ultimately, no one's relieved you of your short-term targets. So isn't this just an extra ad and often falls to the back of the pile? And I guess one of the things that we would love to help reframe from that perspective is that what this doesn't mean, I don't think, is to necessarily drop everything and leave your customers behind. This is a journey, and a journey where you can sustain energy and momentum in that journey by everything that you do. My nana used to say when I was little, the more you do, the more you do. And I never really understood it until I went into business and realized that what she says is right. The more you do, the more it allows you to then do. So we love this example of Lego, which we haven't had anything to do with. We just we admire them as a company, because one thing I think about Lego that they do very brilliantly is that they constantly work to improve their reputation. Like Matt says, they draw attention to the societal impact they can have and their awareness of what they do for society through a myriad different initiatives in various different communities to help children learn and play. And they work with UNICEF, an old employer of mine, who do great work with them. Whilst doing that, they have also created an attractive offer for those who are more ethically aware, who are more concerned potentially about bringing more plastic into their home, with the replay offer, which allows you as a Lego person, a person with Lego who loves Lego, to buy with confidence, because you know in the States and Canada at this stage, you can package up your bricks and send them back to Lego and they will be reused where they're needed in some of those community projects. So that already they started to think about that, a segment that care most and who might have a barrier to buying, and started to think about how they can reuse the stuff they have. And then ultimately what we all know, and what we've heard a lot of reports about, is that their awareness of the risk of literally the fabric of their product, and how they are working to create a plastic-free product by 2030. So I think what's interesting is these things weren't an either or. What it is about is understanding the journey and how you can create progress in that journey by the things that you do now, and also by having a plan for the future and by communicating that plan. We would say that in a way that sort of forms a sort of three-step process, which we've sort of worked on with clients, which allows us to identify that journey in terms of the impact that you make, and also about the scale of where you're working. So in marketing, we're very confident about comms shift, but actually thinking about comms shift in a way which is trying to maximize what your current business does with its current way of going to market to affect social and environmental issues. And that is probably the most within your gift, but also it takes a bit of a mindset change to think about how you might do that, and communicating it, most importantly. Run, sort of next stage stuff, is about looking for those people who will be interested in more ethical, sustainable benefits within your current customer base and giving them new options. So we would call that portfolio shift. That's about adding things, ways to buy, new options, ways that will super serve the people who are choosing on that benefit. And then ultimately, If you want to change the entire model, it's about understanding what the steps are within your supply chain to transform your business's go-to-market. To do that, you will need to bring a lot more people with you. And we can talk a bit more in this presentation about how you create a cohort for change within your board. We've created a canvas which will help people sort of plot these things. This will come to you after this as part of the deck as you go on, but these things are usually best scoped through workshopping and discussion with your community, and that discussion itself will help to drive momentum behind your change and your journey towards change.
So Fern's talked about the restriction and the challenge of dealing with the short term versus the long term, and how you might take a more structured approach to balancing both. And we'll come back to that towards the end as well. A second important but that comes up, and this is a significant one, and Fern touched on it briefly, is customers say they care, but in practice is that how they actually buy, and will that actually drive my sales and penetration targets that I need to hit for this quarter or for this year? I've just chosen one data source. It happens to be from our colleagues at Kantar. It's from the COVID crisis, during the COVID crisis so far, which is 80% think companies should be being more sustainable, but only 41% would actually spend any more on a sustainable product. So we know that there's a significant gap between intention and action. And so we'd like to talk about that a little bit more now as well, because it's a classic challenge to doing anything, frankly, and we think we need to go through that and deal with it. The first one is, customers don't necessarily know what they want yet. And this kind of flies in the face of the idea of customer centricity, and it's probably anathema in the marketing community, but I think that's really important. The opportunity here, I think, is to, within your database of customers, in your base of customers, there will be customers of tomorrow. In other words, people that look more like what in 5 years' time the majority of your base will look like. Those are the people that we suggest is a good place to start, really, to think about testing more powerfully what could work with them, what will work with them, and what assumptions there are about those customer needs that need to be questioned within your own marketing department and organization. And quite often we find that when you show people a new proposition, one they haven't yet asked for, but it's new to the world, what you begin to discover is new sources of value will begin to emerge. So for example, we might well come up with I'm making this up now for it's something which has been done for Unilever, but a new more sustainable soap powder or soap product. And actually some of the benefits that emerge tend to be things around the smell or the experience or the reduction in packaging. And they wouldn't necessarily come to the fore as the number one reason for choice, but in aggregate, they begin to have a big impact on the customer's desire to use and reuse the product. So don't just be part of the faster horse cohort in the marketing community, I guess is what we're saying here. And a great way of thinking about this, which it really struck me, and it's I'll talk to you about the example on the right very briefly, but it's not really about making your existing tasty proposition or product ethical. And by tasty, I mean desirable, high converting. It's not just about finding an ethical or a green or a social wash to apply to the proposition. That isn't the way to go about this. For this super serving this segment of tomorrow's customer, really it's about thinking, how do you make an ethical proposition tasty? In other words, how do you make a proposition that is good for the business, that's going to drive up the ESG ratings when you talk about it in famous ways and you advertise it and market it? How do you make it also incredibly compelling and not more expensive? And that's why there's a degree of engineering required in the marketing function to go and create these products and propositions in the first place. A lovely example is a product emerging from Scandinavia at the moment. You may have heard of Doconomy. This is their Do card. It's a credit card, but it's a credit card that informs you how much your individual purchases are contributing to carbon emissions. So I think the number is something like, for every $1 of spend on your credit card, 1.3 grams of CO2 are emitted. The numbers might be wrong, but it's broadly a point like that. And that is a really fascinating and interesting insight that some people will find powerful for thinking about how they change their behaviors. It's a really interesting way of thinking about evolving the credit card proposition, just for example. Fern.
Yeah, and I think just a very simple place to start is to think about what assumptions are being driven literally by the models that you use. So I've worked in FMCG marketing for a very long time, and I have seen buying cycles very often, and they sometimes are journeys and they're all different sort of shapes and sizes, but largely they move through a classic sort of search, choose, buy, use, reuse, commit. I think what's interesting is if you start to add bits of that experience that you know are there, that just haven't been considered before, you may find sources of value you hadn't realized were there before. So for example, any buying cycle will include 2 moments of disposing things. Firstly, when you get it, there'll be some packaging to dispose of, and secondly, when you dispose of it, probably. And so what's interesting is if you try to understand that experience and then also understand how choices are, you could deliver value on some of the other parts of the choices as well. What you might find is you have options to build value into that proposition that wasn't there before, even if it's just, you know, a freer bin because you haven't got such a big bottle in the middle of it or something like that. That can be a useful value to someone, especially over time. Ultimately, the way to get at these things is, I think, to try them in the market. So this is an example of a client where we moved them from a sort of slow sort of user research, then launch pattern to a test and learn iterative prototyping process, so that we learn more by people getting their hands on the stuff, thinking about it, seeing it almost for real than you would ever do by talking to them in sort of conceptual terms. I love this quote, which was attributed to Nelson Mandela by Sir Clive Woodward, which was, "I never lose, I either win or I learn." And I think once you put your business behind that kind of mindset and start thinking about what do we learn from this experiment? What do we learn from trying something that looks near real to people? Then you can start to really learn where you might add extra value that you never knew you had in your proposition already.
And I think, you know, I know that all of you on this call have been influenced or have heard about the lean and agile working methodology, and we're all doing it in our businesses. But actually, the benefit opportunity here for us as marketers is to really think about lots of small bets. We don't have to bet the farm on one big sustainable push. We can do lots of little tests in a framework that allow us to build momentum over time and generate revenue that pays for the next stage of walk, run, fly. And that's what we'd like to talk to you about more deeply. So we've talked about the challenge of short-termism and sales targets and penetration targets versus the long-term game. We've talked about customers not being prepared or not being approached in the right way to think about buying the products that we'd like to make for the future, products and services. And then a more fundamental one for me really is, and the elephant is a wonderful choice of image here, I think, from Fern, but is the fact that we are swimming in corporate cultures that are we would often term them as legacy cultures. Now, you've come across this when you have to talk to your teams and your colleagues about digital marketing transformation. You know, we've seen it in all sorts of places, but they can be very resistant to change. And sometimes that's very subtle rather than very overt. There can be implicit resistance. And that's something which, you know, a smart marketer that intends to drive this change through the organization or be part of a team doing that at the board level needs to understand how to play this game in a more effective manner. And that's something which we've imported from the management consulting world and the people that we've hired out of that environment. One of the things that absolutely fascinates me, and it may be a phrase you already know, but it's the idea of path dependency. Broadly speaking, it is that we as humans, it's a biological function, we get stuck in a rut very easily. And the reason we do that is it's efficient. You don't want to relearn how to tie your shoelace every day. But of course, in doing so, that begins to create a set of rules about how the world should be. Now, organizations, departments, marketing teams also have path dependencies. And these are, I think, are the biggest obstacles of all to really dealing with this challenge. We call them limiting assumptions. And you'll see signs of them all sorts of places, but they are writ large in processes, in the things that you're measured on, the things that you measure, some of the conventions in the organization, even potentially how you get promoted in the company. And you'll certainly see it in language. And so one of the roles of the marketer, change agent in this space is to think about developing some assumption killing questions, and there are many, but this is just one example. We have again a canvas on assumption busting that we could share separately. But if you knew, so ask yourself this question, ask this of your teams, if you knew that ethical propositions actually unlocked double-digit growth, how would you market differently? You know, and it's forcing yourself into a new headspace, a more creative headspace about how we might deal with these challenges. And just one very specific example which comes to mind. So the sneaker manufacturer Nike had a real challenge in some of their factories where workers were refusing to wear protective masks, even though the fumes of sticking the sole to the shoe were quite toxic. And the sort of limiting assumptions is staff won't wear masks. We've got to find some way of doing it. Do we put cameras in the factories? Do we incentivize them, or do we censure them when they don't do it? You know, that would be the more typical approach of thinking about it. But the freeing assumption in the case of this case study was that the team at Nike decided to think, well, hang on, what if we knew that manufacturing could be non-toxic? What would we then do differently? They invented a non-toxic glue with the help of R&D, and the non-toxic glue was far more effective than the toxic one, showing that when you can, break your path dependency and think differently about the problem, it opens up new avenues for you as a marketer.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that as a marketer, particularly as a senior marketer, you are able to create a culture that that sort of appreciates this mindset within your own team, and your own team are only made up of people, and people have a number of different behavioral biases that you can understand and impact. So if your team is made up of people who they are concerned about, this is great, but I didn't know what ESG was and I'm too afraid to ask and I don't know how to do it. Well, then perhaps what it is about is intervening with, 101s and skills and tools and things that can really help them to understand it better. Could be that it's just not made easy enough for them to do it. Is there a framework for them to offer ideas, to create teams that can actually get together and surround some of these challenges and assumptions? Is it about the feeling that you might be the only one holding the flag? I'm sure you have people on your team and you may feel yourself that you're the only one holding the flag. And I think that must be a real constraint in an organization. So you can often disrupt that by creating spaces, physical spaces that help you to sort of get some social proof behind other people who want to hold the flag too, and also to invite and create rituals where people are invited to participate and create ideas. And that way you sort of develop a crowd. And the more you develop a crowd, the more you will be the people driving the change within the organization. You create a sort of magnetic team and gang that sort of conveys their enthusiasm for the subject. You will find there are people all over your business who want to join in from beyond marketing. And ultimately what that's about is really articulating why this matters to people. People will change when they understand why it matters. And I think some of those factors, those hard numbers on commercial risk, will really help you to help gather people to your cause. It's very hard amongst all of that. Sometimes the more you unpick it and you look at those graphs and you look at the maps with all the heats on all over them, it's just terrifying. It feels like a huge subject and you have no idea where to start. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting is that you may think that a lot of this is without your gift. One thing to think about is whether this is a sort of a trick that I think consultants use quite a lot, and it is hugely powerful, is to provide people with a simple map of where value can be created in this measure. So we've got a version here, which is an audit that we've carried out with clients, which helps people to very quickly see where they can make strides on the ESG marketing model. So you've probably seen these for digital maturity models, and this is one that we've customized for ESG maturity. And what it does is it helps you to understand what to prioritize, how to map out that sort of walk, run, fly models to see where you're already making gains and where perhaps you haven't told anyone about it.
So we're coming to the end now. And I think the point is that, as Fern said at the beginning, we think that taking a structured approach, and this is our experience in the clients we've worked with, where you recognize the limitations of what's possible now, but you begin to work in a constructive and roadmapped way on bigger initiatives that drive towards where you'd like to be and the sort of business you'd like to become and sort of leader you want to be. It's possible to do that. And I'm really, one of the reasons we're so excited about this event today is it's time that the marketing community understood ESG as much as the corporate affairs community does. Those guys have the agenda, they understand the challenge. The marketers have the ability to persuade huge numbers of people at scale to change behavior. We are the best. We're brilliant at changing large volumes of people's minds and behaviors. We need to deploy that more effectively inside and outside organizations. And this is we've tried to show you today a very, deconstructed but stepwise way of working through it. And that's the opportunity that sits with us now, to break the problem down and approach it step by step. And I love this final quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which is, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, keep moving forward. And so my ask of you guys on the call today from us is that, and we're very happy, and this is true for all the speakers, we've all agreed that we would do an hour-long consultation with anyone who wants to take this the next level forward, and we'll do that to try and help you figure out how you can take the next step that you need to take. That is it from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Fern. And both Martin Luther King and Fern's Nana are very inspiring people. Again, there's a couple of questions that have come into me, so I'll fill those in the Q&A. But in the interests of time, Sam, I'd like you to take the floor, please.
Yeah, hello, good morning, everybody. Wonderful to be here with you. So as you know from the beginning, I was CMO for Samsung Electronics UK and Ireland. And while it was a fantastic career opportunity and I worked with some amazing people, it did make me feel like I was not being true to my values and that I had my head firmly stuck in the sand about the state of the world. We did some pretty cool brand campaigns that were force for good based, but they were small in the grand scheme of things of the total budget, and ultimately very hard to convince the wider business of their commercial benefit. So you always get into that ROI discussion. So when I left last year, I was determined to try to use my skills to help the climate crisis, as that had been bothering me for decades. Particularly having a second child last year hammered it home to me that I couldn't stand by and let their generation inherit what looked like a utter disaster. So on my journey over the last year, I met the guys from Blurred, Leo from Grey and the team, who were just as concerned and wanting to do something meaningful. So I thought, as an ex-CMO, one of you guys on the call, basically, one of your sort of tribe, I thought it'd be useful just to share why climate change really does matter to me personally, and hopefully to you as well, but also to your consumers, and how you can do some good with the power that you hold in your jobs, and even better, get great brand differentiation and equity out of it. So with hope and joy for the future, here is the indisputable science, which might come across as a little bit depressing, but we've got to take it on board before we can move forward. So let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay, so as with all things, the science doesn't look particularly friendly, but let's have a little look at this. So there has always been a link between atmospheric carbon dioxide and global temperature, which is what this shows from ice core data. And the fun fact here, guys, if an ice age is usually triggered by a slight wobble in the Earth's spin, which is called precession, and it happens every 120,000 years or so. And every time there is an ice age, the carbon in the air is taken up back into the Earth and the oceans, and then it is released again when the planet warms. And this happens in a lag of about 1,000 years or so after the temperature changes. But if you look on the right-hand side, the human-generated CO2 has driven to double what has ever occurred naturally. And rather than now following temperature rising, carbon is now driving an unprecedented temperature climb. And worryingly, there is now a 30 to 40 year lag the other way. So what we are experiencing now is probably 30 to 40 years ago of carbon emissions, the 1990s. So as Matt pointed out earlier on, the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that if we carry on the way we will see a 4-degree warming, at least, if not 5, this century. If the policies that we're talking about are implemented, we might hit 3, but we need to achieve 1.5 degrees if we're to avoid the worst effects. And this is versus pre-industrialized times, we are already at 1.1 of those 1.5 degrees. So in every year that passes that we continue to not reduce our carbon emissions, the steeper the task gets to achieve the Paris Agreement of 1.5 or even 2. But what's the big deal about such seemingly small numbers? Well, it all comes down to averages. This is a global average, and if you go over the 1.5 degrees, even by 0.5 degree, the differences are absolutely extreme. For instance, as you can see here, extreme heat will be 2.5 times worse, but just down to that 0.5 degree. Sea level and ecological loss are at least double, if not 10 times worse. So it's a really fine scale. But if we carry on doing what we're doing and we hit the 4 degrees, then we start to see a map that could look like this, which shows that huge parts of the planet become desertified, meaning that millions of people will be displaced into the green areas, which is basically where we live. So there's no, often a common sort of reason that people don't get behind this is that, oh, it won't affect me, it'll be in some far off place. Well, the effect of happening in far off places will be coming and knocking on our doors very soon. So there will be, not only that, you've got the biodiversity decline, crops will fail, drinkable water, all the stuff that that Matt has already touched on. And that's if we carry on doing what we're doing. But there are a few things which even those linear models don't take into account of. There are dozens of planetary systems that operate in equilibrium in the current temperature ranges. And if even one of these reaches a tipping point where it can never be recovered, the situation will accelerate even beyond that control. And we're seeing some of that with the methane being reduced in the permafrost tundras, obviously the Amazon forests, and the Atlantic deep water Gulf Stream. And obviously we've all seen very much about the news, the ecological collapse which is happening in parallel. It's obviously related, but it's in parallel. The sixth mass extinction created by our actions. So that's all pretty bad. And I didn't want to, you know, get too heavy, but we definitely don't want this for I don't want it for my children. I don't care about yours. No, we don't want it for our children. But there is hope to avoid this and to reverse the damage. But before we get to that, I, as a marketeer, am fascinated by why it's so hard to get people to take more action about it. Why don't we do something even when we are presented with these facts? Of course, you can say we are not being offered simple, actionable solutions by our leaders, and we feel powerless in the face of the problem. But beneath that, our brains, sadly, are wired to ignore or suppress this kind of situation. Our system 1 brains, or monkey brains, our amygdalas, dominate our behavior, while our rational minds rarely get a look in. We like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, but the rational brain often only comes in after the monkey brain has done something to kind of make the best of it. We have a system of cognitive biases that we're all familiar with some of them, but I bet you didn't know there are probably this many that you can see here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of my favorites are the normalcy bias, a refusal to plan for a disaster that has never happened before. The status quo bias, and that's not obviously Rick Buffett, etc., but the system justification, the support of existing rules, even at the expense of individual and collective self-interest. We know about confirmation bias, we know about the bystander effect, but I think the most horrible one is compassion fade. It's the predisposition to behave more compassionately to a small number of identifiable victims than to a larger number of anonymous ones. So we've got all these built-in Achilles heels, but as marketeers, our jobs are to understand these and, dare I say, exploit them or use them to advantage to change behavior. And that's what I hope we can all as a community try to do. There are solutions to get us down to even the 1.5 degrees that it seems so very hard. Project Drawdown is a great book and website that everybody should have a look through. Has worked through all the technical solutions needed to get to carbon net zero and even remove some carbon from the atmosphere so we keep below the 1.5 degrees. And as you can see, these are the top 20 here out of at least 100, some of which you wouldn't have ever thought of, like refrigeration, for instance, is at number 1 because all modern fridges have got HFCs in the back of them rather than CFCs, which is great from an ozone point of view, but when they get scrapped and that HFC gets leaked into the atmosphere, it's about 4 times worse than carbon dioxide. So that has to be dealt with. So of course, green energy, red meats, and education is all on there as well. It can happen, but it will need to generate the global political pressure and encourage green corporate behavior to create the approximate $1 trillion a year of investment to change the future. So meeting the guys at Blurred taught me about ESG. I didn't even know what it was. Electric shock gerbil was one suggestion when I first mentioned it to a colleague. But it's how the financial world is taking the lead to incentivize the right kind of business, that they can see that their investments will be destroyed if climate change happens the way that it is predicted. And what's encouraging is again what Matt was beginning to talk about, which is a new type of capitalism emerging to replace just a shareholder value, which is the total stakeholder value, including obviously planet and people, rather than just growth and profit. So to me, as a marketing through and through person, it made me realize that this is a no-brainer for a marketing leader to take the lead on this rather than leave it up to other colleagues, almost your own version of the bystander effect in your job. If the company can save huge sums by improving their ESG rating, make sure as a marketeer that those improvements from the front are relevant to the consumer too. Work out those killer differentiated propositions up front and then shape how the company improves itself. That's I suppose the important thing, because often in prior roles you get surprised with some initiative that has happened in sustainability and you're expected to help with it once it's done, but get in there at the front, because you can then turn that differentiation into the best communications that you may ever do. You know, a brand purpose campaign which is actually doing good, makes you and your employees proud and helps your consumers. Obviously, on the flip side, if you don't do it, those companies will be found out by investors and consumers who will hold you accountable. Now, we've seen instances of that where Nike had a misstep with the Black Lives Matters activity they did, and obviously oil companies have had all sorts of missteps, but they have a huge opportunity to also do the right thing. So the point of getting us all together on this Zoom is to reassert just how important this is and draw the link to, like I say, the power that you hold in your roles. The people that were presented, we can help you with that, create that story and propositions that will work. So if you're going to do just 3 things after this, then I would suggest that it is, the first of all, speak to us. It's a free initial consultation with the experts that you've heard from. Understand ESG for yourself and your own situation and your role, and how to get others around the ExCo leadership to engage and build a coalition of the concerned and willing, because this is how change really happens. Build a walk, run, fly roadmap so you can begin somewhere. So you have a well-phased ESG marketing plan that becomes self-funding once the savings come through. And look to super serve your ethical consumer of tomorrow segment that doesn't exist now but will grow into being huge with new propositions, products and services. If nothing else, decarbonize your business. Many aspects obviously to this, but the single most important step is to end all consumption of electricity generated from coal or gas and switch to 100% renewable power tariffs instead. It's not hard. The faster the world turns away from coal and gas for power generation, the better. And renewable power generation is all about economies of scale. And then finally, pick an S factor where you can make the greatest difference and go for a big ambition, such as diversity and inclusion, or even workplace safety and well-being, but get involved with and focus on what you can really make a difference with. So I really believe that now is the perfect time to make your company fit for the future, differentiated versus your competitors, and do some of the best creative work of your career. All that can be self-liquidating from the savings that you've created, making you the hero of the boardroom. So if COVID, final thoughts, has taught us one thing, we can't control nature. And preparing now and doing a small bit to help is surely a win-win for all. So thanks for that. And back over to Kate.
Thanks so much, Sam. I would like to invite the fabulous Mike Baylor in to ask his question, but perhaps before we make that work technologically, Sam, a question that you might start with, and let's open this to our panel. Today's session has clearly demonstrated the business benefits in every sense of that expression of doing the right thing by E, S, and G, for planet, for people, for profit. How do marketing leaders, however, balance the short-term, immediate and mid-term requirements of meeting targets with the longer-term strategy that this requires? Perhaps, Sam, you can lead us off with that.
Yeah, I mean, I know what it felt like to be drinking from the fire hose of the having the sales or whoever's your sort of bête noire bashing you about what are you going to do about hitting the targets. You know, you're not doing the right sort of activities, and you're just caught up in that constant. The thing is I think is to bring everybody into the tent initially up front. Don't try and sort of be creating something in a vacuum. You need to create that initial exco buy-in, but before you go to the exco, make sure that you've got your story absolutely watertight, and bring in, you know, hence bringing together some of the experts from this call to make that happen.
Thank you. Mike, can you unmute? Your question was really interesting with regard to corporate purpose being either misunderstood and or misaligned and or minimized.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Actually unmuted. It's one of the great dramas, isn't it? Is am I unmuted or not of today? Yeah, great session, and I enjoyed what everybody had to say. I have, since taking on a piece of, completely out of the blue a couple of years ago, a piece of quite profound corporate purpose work, I came to realize a couple of things, and have written about it and since continue to work around that area. Couple of things. First of all, that the clear understanding and definition of a robust corporate purpose is absolutely critical to the departure point for all this. And in fact, in the absence of that being led from board level, you know, shareholder buy-in and so on, for marketing to have an impact, and for that to trickle down into brand purpose and the really sort of important behaviors that everyone's talked about today, is impossible without that higher level corporate purpose piece. And I've come to understand corporate purpose as actually sitting almost above corporate strategy these days. The other thing I came to understand is how profoundly misunderstood purpose is. It's alongside the other incredibly important business imperative of the day, so-called digital transformation. The amount of understanding is still woefully light. And I would just be very interested in the panel's thoughts on, are you seeing what I see? And is corporate purpose a critical anchor point, pivot point for this change? And B, do we have an awful lot of work to do to make it better understood in the business community?
I'd like to pick that up. Thank you, Mike. I mean, I think that's, you know, bang on really, and fascinating. And I'll be very honest with you all on the call. When we're thinking about, you know, built this consulting practice out of an ad agency background, brought management consultancy in, and are trying to push up and have been successful in pushing to a higher level earlier conversation, frankly, about strategy and how it becomes marketed. And one of the things that we were talking about with somebody on this call, I won't mention them to save their blushes, but was, should we even bother to having this conversation with marketers? Of course the answer is yes, but the point was, to really affect the deep change that's required is a cross-functional, high-level, board-level solution. It can only work that way. Otherwise, we're, as I said at the beginning of our presentation, you know, making yummy ones a bit greener rather than making the green thing yummy. And you have to get to the fundamentals of this. But I also believe it has to be a stepwise process. So that's why we approached it in that way. I think that brand purpose is on everyone's lips, and frankly, as an advertising planner in the past, we sort of made them up to fit with what we thought we could use to kind of inspire a generation of customers to get engaged. But were we really integrating that deeply into the fundamentals of the business, into how the client side chief strategy officer was determining what he or she was going to buy next, into what the CEO and the CFO are going to invest in? And the answer was no. And I think that's the opportunity here, is to, we've got to keep, there's no long term without short term. We all know that. So we've got to keep the wheels on. But I think the moment is now for marketers to work as tightly as possible and with a good deal of information, for example, about how ESG ratings affect your capital, the ability to borrow capital, and have an adult and commercial conversation at the top level about what we can do about it. We do have such an amazing skill set to bring to bear on this challenge.
Matt, I know you'll have a...
Yeah, let me just jump in. So I think it's really important to think of purpose as a continuum from ESG. So for us at Blurred, we talk about ESGP. And the reason why we say that is because if you think about it logically, before you can prove to the world that you exist to do good, which is ultimately what your purpose is, you must first prove that you seek to do no harm, which is what ESG is. And in our experience, when a conversation with a client or a prospective client begins with the P word, we almost, well, not almost, 100% of the time, we have to go back and say, well, let's just talk about where you sit on the ESG spectrum. Because the world won't buy what you say if, for example, you have some amazing product that improves people's lives that just so happens to be made in a factory in a sweatshop conditions with, you know, child slave labor. You will be called out for being deeply inauthentic. So the first point I would emphasize is think of this as ESGP. It is a continuum. Your purpose will not be valid unless you have understood your environmental, societal, and governance risks. The wheels will come off. The second point is the word purpose is in danger of becoming one of the most abused and bastardized in corporate life. And actually, in reality, if you think about it, there are three common definitions of purpose out there. There's brand purpose, which again, in our experience, often leads companies down the wrong road because they end up essentially producing strap lines and advertising collateral, not actually thinking about what is the real reason for existence of this business, let alone its ESG risks. There's corporate purpose, which again, frankly, in reality is often synonymous with mission, the kind of stuff that companies put in their annual report, but not one single employee, if you approach them, actually lives it, breathes it, or even knows what it is. And then there's social purpose. And social purpose is really important because if you look at, again, I sort of look at things through the investor lens because that drives so much of this. If you go back to the letter that Larry Fink, the chief executive of BlackRock, the world's largest investment fund, wrote to every board 5 years ago now, and I was still at Vodafone, and I received, this letter came through to me. In that letter, Larry Fink basically put down a marker with every company where the world's largest investor has a position. And he said, from now on, we expect your company to have, wait for it, a social purpose. That was the term that he used. And we know the BlackRock team, and we understand that that bit of language, social purpose, was very, very, very carefully considered. The underlying point that he made in his letter, and that the reason why the social purpose movement has got the legs that it does, is because companies have to prove that their core reason for existence, that the way that they deliver their value for shareholders, the way they generate returns, is through delivering a societal good. There is a thing that they do that is core to their mission, which in itself is a social good. If the company doesn't know what that is, it needs to go away and work out what it is. If it works really hard to try to understand what it is, but it can't find it, chances are it's in trouble. Yeah, if you cannot articulate a genuine social purpose, you're not going to be able to persuade the world that you really exist to do good.
Thank you, Matt. I had a question which is in line with Leonie and Kirsten, actually, to talk about kind of, again, beyond comms and into product or service. So where I was going to start was, what if one is in a business that would originally be called non-ethical? And I put this to Sam and Matt, but I'd like, so for example, gambling or tobacco. Perhaps Leonie, if you're still on the call, can I ask you to come in and ask your question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, and thank you for the presentations. They were really thought-provoking. My question was around consumer tipping points. So I think that the data is really compelling when looked at in aggregate, which I think is the point you've all made. But from a consumer perspective, there's obviously lots we can do to nudge as marketeers. But I was wondering if you were looking forward and seeing some real tipping points for consumers in how their demand would suddenly change for the type of products they wanted and how they might shop. And I've almost been surprised to see this year that things like the Boohoo supply chain issues that they have had no impact on their sales performance, with a population that I would have thought were super sensitive to those sort of issues. It was almost discouraging to see that that didn't drive change. So it'd be great just to get some perspectives on that.
If I maybe have a go at it first, I think it can come. My passion for psychology sort of helped me try to frame this a bit, which is that people might are aware of all the issues, and they, in their rational minds, but their irrational monkey brains don't give a shit. They're still looking at the four F's of fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. Good little gag there. But the main thing is that the tipping points will only come when we make the message relevant to their monkey brain, rather than what we've just done and given a whole load of charts. Charts are probably the worst way of doing it, you know, because that just goes, as we've seen, even with all of David Attenborough's great work, it doesn't get absorbed into behavior. So what I'm hoping is that we can eventually, as we design these propositions going forward, then make it super personalized and relevant for people. So for instance, if you are able to show Fiona in Manchester that the effects of what's going to happen to their children in Manchester over the course of the next 5 years, that she's going to take much more notice of that than if it's just what we've presented on charts. But obviously there's a huge link to that with how products and services can market themselves towards that without making it apocalyptic.
Yeah, I think if I can jump in, I think one other thing to think about, and I think the Boohoo example is extremely well chosen, because, you know, we're seeing a flood of fast fashion at the moment, and there's a sort of small movement of anti-fast fashion that's sort of slightly gathering momentum behind it. I think what's interesting is potentially thinking about social proof as a marketeer, and how providing people with visible symbols of having chosen differently could have a value to them. So I think that I, for example, spend a lot of time in looking at clothes, and I think that there is a small momentum gathering behind the fast fashion movement. We've seen some interesting launches this year, and I think what marketers can do is to think about how they can accelerate those movements by making each member of those communities more visible to the wider community. And that's what will create a tipping point. If we're all doing the right thing quietly in our houses, no one will notice, and no one will recruit others. So I wonder if there is a sticky way, and we've seen it sort of beginning to happen in fashion, and really notably happening in younger audiences. I believe that will create change long term. I think they will increasingly wear their different choices on their sleeve. I think Depop, for example, is a hugely powerful movement to try to reduce the purchase of new clothes, and that's become a sort of social movement, really.
Just a quick one for me. I think human beings take action when the consequences of inaction are immediate, obvious, and threatening. For consumers with something like fast fashion, there's no obvious reason why consumers should moderate their behavior because of something that happens hundreds of miles away, in Boohoo's case in Leicester, or thousands of miles away. Whereas for investors, the consequences of inaction are super, super clear. And Boohoo is a really interesting case study from an investment point of view, because it sends shockwaves through the whole ESG community. Boohoo was actually quite highly rated as in ESG terms prior to the revelations in the media. And it was highly rated because what became clear in retrospect is that ESG ratings agencies rely on desk research, back to my point about looking at public communications only. And there was an assumption that because the clothes are made in Leicester, and Leicester is in the UK, and the UK is highly regulated and a mature, developed country, that by definition it must be better than making the clothes in Bangladesh. And nobody actually got on a train to check. Yeah. So whilst from a consumer perspective, tipping points, I would say, tend to happen very late, and they tend to happen when it is really, really obvious that consumers need to do something differently. Further upstream, the companies that own the organizations and the individuals that own all these companies are already facing those tipping points. They're already confronted with the consequences of inaction, and not, what happens when they don't think through the consequences of what lies in front of them, Boohoo being a case in point. And as much as anything else, the decisions upstream in the investment world are going to shape what the consumer experiences.
Thank you, Matt. Emma, the lovely Emma Inston, when we're thinking about the sort of customer value that we've just been talking about, you had an interesting question. You were appreciating the walk, run, fly model from Leo and Fern. I'd love to bring you in to ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone. This is a great session. It really is. Yeah, I really like the walk, run, fly model around communications portfolio and then model. It's two things, actually. One, interested if you could expand a bit on how best to identify your customer segment of the future, because I guess that could be around a number of things, including value, ability to influence, type of motivation. And also just tagging on another thought, and I attended, by the way, the Green Horizon Summit a couple of weeks ago. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but that's great content too. And what struck me from that was the opportunity for collaboration, particularly in the kind of portfolio and model phases and across sectors like energy, financial services, technology, telco, and automotive. So just interested on your thoughts around a couple of points there, please.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Emma. And hello again, I haven't seen you for about a decade.
Yeah, great to see you.
Something which marketers don't really understand, and I think is fascinating around, and we'll come on to the question around segment in a moment, but around circular economics, the idea of pre-competition. So we spend our whole lives working out how to deposition someone else and beat them. Actually, one of the solutions to the challenge that we face is actually pre-competition. So we should, if we're all cereal manufacturers or all snack manufacturers, we need to work together to organize a better supply chain, and then after that we can get into making our product the more beautiful, the more fantastic experience, the more enjoyable, with the highest benefits. So I think there's quite a culture shift required to think about that kind of collaboration, within categories, and of course with the partners that we work with. Getting to your segmentation question, I think, and I know you've got a direct marketing background, Emma, but you've identified three of the, I think, the killer factors that would help you work out who the customers of tomorrow are. One is immediate buying behavior that you can spot now. I think that we can contextual data to understand other brands and interests that they have and other content that they consume, which will help us to really pick them out. I would be really keen and encourage you guys to try pretotyping. So not prototyping where you have to make something necessarily, but a pretotyping approach where using content, for example, as a hook, see who picks it up, and then invite them into a conversation and dialogue thereafter. And that's one way of capturing them. And clearly those who are more influential in terms of their social reach and influence, and those who have a greater lifetime value, that's your perfect kind of coming together of variables that will drive. And I think a small number of really interesting looking customers of tomorrow will help set an agenda wonderfully for an organization. We used to talk about golden customers. And must be a phrase that we can have for a kind of more future facing version of a golden customer. I don't know where the third.
Another place to look is to look at the ones who are leaving you for more sustainable options and copycat segment them, because also that will focus the mind of the board. You need to create a burning platform here in a sense of what will happen if I don't. And I think that kind of ties in with this idea of risk. The reason that the risk is there is because the city believes, more than perhaps marketers do, that people will go elsewhere. And so if we sort of embrace the city's belief, then we need to understand where they're going, and then we can copycat segment them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Guys, we've got 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of our expert panel members to respond to one last question as a parting gift for us all, please. And that is, we've heard so much, we've seen so much evidence across so many different important variables for taking action today. The question, therefore, is, how would you convince the dissenting voices in your organization that taking action is imperative? Perhaps, Matt, we start with you on that question.
Yeah, it's probably the most important question of all, actually. The first thing is you've got to go with the grain of the business. The whole point about ESG and indeed purpose is that there has to be a business plan that underpins it. Otherwise, people will not engage. When I was with Vodafone, we decarbonized Vodafone, moved to 100% renewable power globally, because we took a business case into the executive and into the board that showed what would happen in terms of the cost of electricity in the future once carbon pricing was introduced if the company did not do that. And the long story short, we should show them a chart which showed a cost of 1.1 billion euros rising to 2.4 billion euros, and the company had no plan and not even an idea that that risk was out there. And by the end of the meeting, we'd agreed to move to 100% renewable power. Go with the grain of the business, get the data, get a coalition of the willing, and go in with hard numbers, and you will make the case for change.
Phenomenal. Perhaps, Sam, you might want to choose to answer that next.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that is that no doubt the path dependency that Leo was talking about is that finance is king, profit and growth short term are king. So start with that in talking in that language, but as you're doing it, try to imbue it with the sense of belief and caring, if you like. Bring the storytelling and personality into it to engage that system, one part of the brains that everybody's got. They're all human at the end of the day, so that over time people will transition to the total stakeholder value model rather than just the profit model.
Thanks, Sam.
I would
Yeah.
Sorry. I would find a couple of small bets, 2 small experiments to run to generate real world client-centered, my own data that makes the case and build it from there, so that rather than trying to take the assassins on directly, I might well come to them with, well, I've tried it this way and look what happened. Mm-hmm. And that's how innovation often works in organizations, slightly to the side and then becomes sort of brought in on board. Mm-hmm. That might be my approach.
I think I would use the data at your disposal to start building the case of the burning platform. I would start looking at customers who aren't coming or customers who are leaving, and sort of in tandem with that would like you to think about, I think some of the words Sam was saying in terms of a more exciting and positive way of framing your business's value. So that actually sort of, you begin to set yourself up as the answer to the change, not just the sort of driver of the bad news.
Fixing and telling together. Panel, thank you so much. Everybody that's attended today, I really hope you got use and value out of this session. Like I said, we'll be sharing content with everybody that's interested after this. And don't forget the genuine offer of a free consultation should you wish to make a beginning with this. Guys, thank you so much. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you all. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks guys. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.